Laphroaig. So this is just because I wanted to drink Laphroaig, but we haven't done the classic 10 in a very long time. And again, as I said before, I'm trying to kind of reach into like the true classics and talk about them again. Now this bottle, look at that, almost empty. This is not an old bottle. We bought this bottle last week. There's a group of us that sat around drinking Laphroaig. Whoops. So I took the rest of the bottle. I'm like, I'm just going to use the last of that bottle to shoot a video. And I'm going to shoot something that is going to seem, for some of you, kind of basic and fundamental. But I get this question a lot. A lot of people in whiskey are confused by the 5 primary categories of Scotch, right? What's blended malt? What's blended Scotch? What's blended grain? What's single malt? What's single grain? What do you mean, right? Scotland whiskey definitions can be a little confusing for the outsider. They just think, well, it's all Scotch, right? Oh, it's all Scotch or it's single malt. Well, no, actually, there are 5 categories of Scotch. So what I'm going to teach you today, in case you didn't know, is the 5 categories of Scotch. You can send this video to someone if you are trying to explain to them the 5 categories of Scottish whiskey. Now, this is how I think of it, and I've seen diagrams that sort of mimic this but don't use this language. Lou Bryson's whiskey book does a great job of this in a diagram. I think of it as mom, dad, and the 3 kids. So first, let's talk about mom and dad, and then we're going to drink, and then I'm going to talk about the 3 kids, and that's the 5 styles of Scottish whiskey. First, mom is single malt Scotch, right? Now, we in the West have a problem, which was we put our qualifiers, adjectives and adverbs and things like that, before our nouns, right? So we say the red ball instead of the ball that is red. Most Latin languages put it afterwards, right? And so in most Latin languages, you start by saying, this is a ball, and then you start describing it. And that's very clear communication. In English, we say, it's red, and then we still don't know what we're talking about. The ball. Oh, okay. And because of that, we view a word like single malt, and we think that the single is an adjective of the word malt. But it's not. The word single and the word malt are talking about 2 different things. Single in Scotland means 1 distillery. That's it. Malt means 100% barley, malted barley, because malt is short for malted barley, right? So when you say, I have a single malt, like Laphroaig single malt, where's the word there? Islay single malt, what that means is 1 distillery, Laphroaig, malt. This is 100% malted barley and pot still, run in a pot still, right? Now, that's mom, single malt, 1 distillery, 100% malted barley in a pot still. Then you have dad, grain whiskey. Now, grain whiskey shows up because in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the Industrial Revolution created an opportunity for a new kind of production, and instead of using pot stills to make whiskey, they created column stills. Well, column stills strip most of the flavor profile out of the grain as it goes through, and it's distilled at a much higher rate. And so eventually they said that you can call that whiskey, but it's got to be called grain whiskey, not malt whiskey. Even if you use barley, it's got to be called grain whiskey because it went through a column still. So grain whiskey means grain run through a column still. Now these days, and actually then, it could be any grain. It's rarely malt because malt's expensive. It's more often wheat or corn, sometimes rye, because these are cheaper commodity grains. And so very often a grain whiskey from Scotland is a wheat whiskey or a corn whiskey. And it has some barley in it, but it's mostly wheat or corn. And it's run through a column still, and it's put into a barrel. So if you take grain whiskey, made at 1 distillery, like say Garvin or Loch Lomond, and it's aged at that, and you bottle it, what you have is a single grain Scotch, right? Single means 1 distillery, grain is the production quantifier, and Scotch because it's made in Scotland, right? So now you've got mom, single, 1 distillery, malt, barley, this whiskey, and dad, single, I should have brought a single grain in here, single grain Scotch. Fair? That's mom and dad. Now, when you start mixing things together, you get the 3 kids. Fair? All right. First, let's talk about Laphroaig. What do you even say about Laphroaig? Laphroaig is on Islay. Laphroaig is what most people think of when they think of Islay. I would argue that Laphroaig and Lagavulin, those two, when people say Islay Scotch, if they're thinking of a smell or a taste, they're imagining what Laphroaig and Lagavulin taste like. And that's just how it is, right? This is the quintessential briny, smoky, almost smoked fish. It's herbal and vegetation. It's smoke and ash and seaweed. These sound like terrible things unless you love this, in which case they're amazing things. And if you live with it long enough, behind all of that, there's this really soft, sort of like pear-like fruitiness behind all of the drama. And this like caramel, like layered thread that softens it and sweetens it a little and makes it approachable. So it's not just pure medicine. And then on the palate, that's where it goes soft and then just explodes into briny, salty, seaweed, oak, or barrel. Not a lot of barrel, but you get sort of the dryness of barrel notes. That's a great whiskey. This is a separator. If you pour this for someone who's never had whiskey before, they're going to hate you. Or be like, I actually, that's not totally true. There have been many tastings that I've done, many tastings that I've done, where Laphroaig was the one that made someone turn into a whiskey drinker. And I could not believe it. And it was almost always women who didn't like Speyside and were okay with the Irish, didn't like bourbon. And then I pour them Laphroaig and they're like, oh, now that's wild. I like that. And you're like, holy shit, I would never have imagined that. But it happens. Laphroaig has converted people to whiskey drinkers way more than you would ever imagine from tasting Laphroaig and not being a fan. Okay, so let's talk about the 3 kids. If you have 2 moms, and that means, remember, mom is single malt Scotch. If you take a bottle and you put together 2 moms, 2 bottles of single malt Scotch, what you've created is still malt, because 100% of the ingredients in that mix is malted barley pot stilled whiskey, right? So your second word, malt, doesn't change because malt is malt. And both of these were malt. Just because you mixed them doesn't mean they're not malt. They're still malt. However, it's no longer 1 distillery, so that word single can't be there anymore. So we swap the word single for blended. And now you've got blended malt Scotch. That just means we took together 2 single malts or more. Sometimes it could be 40 or 20. But we took together a bunch of single malts. We put them together. Now it's a blended malt Scotch, right? If you have 2 dads, that's 2 single grain whiskeys, right? And you mix them together, it's still grain whiskey. So that doesn't change. But it's not single grain anymore because you mix multiple distilleries together, and that makes it blended grain Scotch, right? Now, if you have a mom and a dad, you mix together single malt and single grains. What you end up with is, it's not malt and it's not grain whiskey anymore. What is it? It's Scotch. It has no qualifier. It's just Scotch. I almost knocked that over. Did you guys see that? And it's blended because we mixed multiple distilleries together. So if you mix grain and malt together, it becomes blended Scotch. It's the simplest title of all the categories. It's also the source of most budget Scotch, but blended Scotch doesn't have to be. It can be beautiful and amazing, right? Johnny Walker's a blended Scotch. The fancy, expensive Johnny Walkers are often blended Scotches. Some of my favorite blends are blended Scotches. And then you get people like Compass Box who are doing blended grain with hedonism, which is crazy, but it's great. And then you've got a lot of blended malts, and some of the fancier, like Johnny Walker Green, is a blended malt, which means they didn't use any grain whiskey. And that's how you get it. Mom, Dad, and the 3 kids. I hope that helps. And I'm really glad you're here. Cheers to you. Ha ha ha. Mom, Dad, and the 3 kids want you to like and subscribe.